Everybody, this is my chin. Chin, this is everybody. Sandwiched between my nose and throat, my chin is the body part from which I paint. From what part of your body do you paint?
For example, Goya paints from the mouth. At age 73, Goya survived a terrible illness and celebrated by painting directly on the walls of his home, as if his endurance summoned ghastly visions painted in tones of black. It's all about the mouth. Suffering figures being kept alive by feeding and being fed, consuming, biting, shrieking, sucking, vomiting, both living and dead flesh. I paint from the chin. I'll explain. As a child of coastal South Carolina, I laid on my stomach in the mud, examining oysters, clams, and other soft-mouthed life. Here was the whole of a view, not from above looking down, but a mollusk's vantage point, 1,000,000 miles close. I paint the landscape in the same way I learned to see it, by lying on my belly, with the tide foamed around my chin. Foreground so close I can taste it, and background far away. No middle ground. I tried this on the Great Lawn in Central Park, but the police made me leave. When your chin is in the mud, you feel contained and close. There's nowhere to go but inward. That was the right landscape for me.
Where is the right landscape for you? What part of your body connects you to that place?
This is important because painting is, before anything else, a transfer of energy. That's why you must see it in the flesh, the skin of the viewer to the skin of the paint. You don't go to a museum to stand in front of an idea, but a physical object, separate from yourself, carefully constructed for the sheer purpose of contemplation. Materials have presence. It's why Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top built his guitar out of wood from Muddy Waters' house. Things remember. It doesn't matter if you paint clipper ships or geometric abstraction. If your painting doesn't have presence, you might as well be making placemats. How do you paint with presence?
Stop making art. If your goal is to make art, it will end up looking like someone else's. Your job is to manufacture a state of lucidity and keep it around as long as possible. In other words, it's the singer, not the song. Art is precious. Things are not. Make a ton of things and destroy most of them. Over time, you'll learn that art doesn't give, it takes. Like any living thing, it must be fed. Feed it your time. Learn your materials. The more you know about paint, the more presence your work will have. Don't let facts get in the way of truth. The surface is the truth.
Every painting is abstract because the laws of nature are bent to fit the laws of art. To abstract means to remove, which implies it must be removed from something. Painter Emile Bernard said, quote, "You have to simplify the spectacle to make some sense of it. You have, in a way, to draw its plan," unquote. When you learn to see the world as shapes and colors, it's easier to paint shapes and colors. Be a maker, not a matcher. To paint is not to copy, but to consent. To grant permission for one thing to stand in for another. This is not a chair. It is skins of colored pigment standing in for a chair. Edwin Dickinson asks us to trust our sensitivity. When you deprive a thing of its meaning and even its name, you remove certainty, allowing the thing to become only itself. That's presence. Touch stuff. I embarrass my kids because I touch everything. I'm a tactile person. Walls, table surfaces, corridors, fabrics, flowers, crumbs, and corners. Whenever I walk in the woods, I carry a stick with which to poke and point, a practice gleaned from reading about Walt Whitman. I pretend that my eyes are on the tip of the stick as it tracks across bumpy surfaces, creating a material correspondence between the thing and my body.
Paint every day. I used to tell people that I took Christmas and birthdays off, but that's a lie. I paint every day. Now, I only might pick up a brush for 2 hours a day or less. The rest of the time is spent sitting in a chair looking at the painting. If it sucks, I scrape it off and start over. Flatline is always better than life support. But I show up every single day, regardless of the results. You can do your whole life's work in less than 2 hours a day. Learn your materials. Put down the books and monkey with stuff. Buy cheap paint, but use fistfuls of it. Try different mediums to see what they do. The most common is refined linseed oil. It's smooth and dries at a medium rate, which is good for beginners. It smells really good too. The first thing Katie does when I walk in the door is smell my head. It smells like tree, she says.
Sun-thickened linseed oil, or stand oil, is thick and sticky like honey and dries very slowly. Safflower oil is pale, silky, and slow drying. It's also good for cleaning brushes. I like walnut oil as it's less prone to yellowing than linseed and also slows drying time. I mix this with thinner and Gamblin's Galkid in thirds. Galkid is an alkyd resin that's good for glazing. It dries in about 24 hours to a glossy, enamel-like finish. I like the way it dissolves brushstrokes into jewel-like puddles. If I want slower drying time, I add more walnut oil. Vary your tools. The mark is the consequence of one person's efforts, eternally in the present tense. Use your hands, your arms, book covers, credit cards, mops, and even tree bark. The more vitality your surfaces have, the narrower the gap between your heart and your viewers. Saul LeWitt said, quote, "If an artist has the same concept but changes material, then his idea has something to do with the material." End quote.
Lastly, get out of your creepy studio and into the world. Art arises from lived experience. I read to public school kids every Wednesday morning. I do Tai Chi every Thursday evening at our local community center. And I watch Dallas and Star Trek, original only, because they make me feel safe and they are predictable. They are what Stravinsky called the cool spot on the pillow. The more boring my life, the wilder my painting.
Composition is a big FU to nature. Reality is doubted, re-examined, and improved through composition. Proportion matters. For example, I drew a circle on this sheet of paper. Look how adjusting the frame changes everything. Symmetry feels static. Asymmetry is movement or the promise of movement. Down low feels earthly. Up high is divine. Far away suggests a figure in space, while close up is more abstract, because positive and negative space become interchangeable. The circle never changes, but the pictorial energy does. If there is one thing I'm certain of, it's that Woody Woodpecker wasn't funny. He was only funny for a woodpecker. Context matters. Here is a new painting in progress that will be shown by Forum Gallery in the Art Dealer Association's annual art show at the Park Avenue Armory here in New York next November. As usual, the way into painting has nothing to do with painting. I think about soda cups, large, medium, and small. Never make any two parts of your painting the same. For example, I have a large amount of red and pink, a medium amount of green-yellow, and a tiny amount of popsicle orange. These hierarchies of proportion create anticipation from large to small. My focal point is slightly off-center, using the rule of thirds principle, in which you divide the plane into thirds vertically and horizontally, like a tic-tac-toe board. Each of the 4 intersections marks an area of energy in the composition. I'm thinking about German Romantic painter Philipp Otto Rung, 1777 to 1810, who was one of the finest examples of German Romanticism, which was an intellectual movement in German-speaking countries in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, influencing philosophy, aesthetics, literature, and criticism. A reaction against the logic, reason, and the industrialization of the Enlightenment, the Romantics emphasized the tension between the rational day-to-day world and the irrational, even supernatural realm. Art is born of friction, of the high-speed collision between opposing forces. Forcing stuff that doesn't go together is itself content. That's why you should have a messy studio. If your space looks like a sushi bar, tuna here, yellowtail there, quail eggs over there, then the accidental collisions can't happen. I'm neat in my daily life, but a hog in my studio. For me, Rung straddles 2 pictorial spaces simultaneously, layered space and stacked space. You either look into the illusion or at the surface, but you can't do both at the same time.
For example, layered space feels natural. All you have to do is stand up and look. You see one thing in front of another and another to establish depth of field. Stacked space feels unnatural. Now you've got my attention. I am not a nature painter, but an unnature painter. Nature looks best laid out on my studio table. There's a reason the first 3 letters of the word artificial are art. When you learn to see the world as shapes and colors, it's easier to paint shapes and colors. Stack space means tipping the picture plane up to the front, kind of like a windshield. For this reason, I love Rung's cutouts of flowers, because they are free beauty, independent of any agenda or explanation.
My point is, keep it simple. Art doesn't need us to understand, only experience. In other words, can you say human things with more than a human voice? As usual, the poets were right. Robert Frost masks himself in obviousness. He refers to the sound of sense, only the rhythm of the words, not the content. Kind of like listening to the muffled sounds of people talking on the other side of a door. You can't understand the words, you only hear the tones. There is no meaning, yet there is content. Kind of like walking into a pitch-black room and picking up an object. For a split second, knowledge precedes identification. Painter Philip Guston called this graspability. A painting should have graspability. You should be able to know a work of art all at once. Prolonged looking doesn't add much to the initial knowledge. It just reproduces that first sensation. That's the difference between information art, which is everywhere, and optical art. Don't ask what it means until you ask, what am I looking at? If you appeal to the attentive eye, you make attentiveness itself the object of representation. Pleasure is itself knowledge. That's why I make these videos, to show you that art is born of lived experience. My message is simple. This is what I do and how I do it. There's room in the arts for all of us, from the TikTok generation to the clock is ticking generation. I had generous teachers. I do what I was taught to honor them. There is quiet activism in just being nice. When I was a sophomore at the College of Charleston, I attended a small wine and cheese reception in the student gallery with my teacher, Michael Tyzak, and a couple of other students. Afterwards, he made a beeline to the door, and I'll never forget what he said. Now we can get back to being major painters. I don't know if he was uttering this to himself or to the collective, but I remember arrogantly thinking, I love him like a daddy, but is he a major painter? I was 18. I knew everything because I read art news. Elizabeth Murray, Willem de Kooning, David Hockney, Joan Mitchell, those were major painters. But I was wrong. I missed my teacher's point entirely. Winston Churchill said the most important thing about education is appetite. Success is too often confused with popularity, and we can never have enough of that. True success is curiosity and effort. They are the only two things that can't be taken away by someone else. They make you 10 feet tall and bulletproof. During one of his live shows in Las Vegas in the 60s, Dean Martin, because I like using contemporary references, allegedly stopped singing to address a banquet of people rudely talking and clinking glasses. It's okay, he said. In Frank's show, meaning Sinatra, you must be quiet and pay attention. But baby, you can park cars during my show for all I care. Nothing bothered Michael. That's how you get a career. That's how you become a major painter. As I grow older, I think differently than before. I'm not the same painter I was when I made my first video for you 15 years ago. We've grown older together. Older artists tell younger ones to ignore trends and fads, but deep down, they know that young people are excited about new ideas. So was I. Maybe we geezers warn against fashions because we aren't part of them. We just wait, patiently, until trends give way to art that endures, like ours. This is partly why I make academic drawings, because accuracy can be judged. It either looks like a tush or it doesn't. That's why the Treasury puts recognizable faces on currency. Anything unfamiliar looks weird and therefore suspicious. But our job is to stand naked in traffic. Remember, I grew up in an amusement park, so I think of the art world as a gigantic dunk tank clown. Anxious people line up and throw stuff at the clown. Someone hits the bullseye, and the clown goes down with a splash, only to reset with a smirk, and the whole thing starts over. Different year, same clown. I've been painting for 5 decades, and I've seen dozens of trends come and go. But the truth is that as soon as the new hot artist hits the market, he or she is already obsolete. What critics call cutting edge is already establishment. The very fact that the media called Howard Stern a shock jock meant that he was mainstream. Andy Warhol became everything that he protested. Only an amateur walks into his or her studio and says, "Today, I will be provocative." In the words of Bob Dylan, quote, "Fearing not that I become my enemy in the instant that I preach," end quote. The most radical thing you can do is be yourself. One of the best parts about growing up in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, was Brookgreen Gardens, a 9,100-acre sculpture garden and wildlife preserve located in Murrells Inlet, created in 1932 by philanthropists Archer Milton Huntington and Anna Hyatt Huntington, a major sculptor and patron of the arts. By the way, the Huntingtons split their time between the low country of South Carolina and Manhattan. Their mansion at 1083 Fifth Avenue later became the National Academy of Design. In my early teens, my mom would drop me off with my Star Trek backpack full of paper and pencils at the gate under Fighting Stallions, a stunning sculpture by Anna Hyatt Huntington. That's where I learned to draw trees. I'm still learning. But I wasn't the first. Sigmund Freud said, Everywhere I go, I find that a poet has been there before me. Sigmund Abeles was born in 1934 and grew up in my hometown of Myrtle Beach, although we didn't meet until we were both in New York decades later. We referred to ourselves as a couple of sea monkeys who did okay in the big city. Sig was educated at the University of South Carolina, where he befriended Jasper Johns before moving to New York to study under Edwin Dickinson and Isabel Bishop. He was one of the finest draftsmen I've ever seen and imbued every subject he painted with a psychological intensity that came from direct observation. Sig was raised in a rooming house in Myrtle Beach that his mother ran. That house was directly across Kings Highway from mine, but Sig was long gone before I was even born. There, he witnessed strangers come and go on their way from northeast cities to Florida for the season. Myrtle Beach is halfway. Sig told me that he developed a fascination for how many types of people could occupy the same domain. In those transient encounters, he honed the ability to see what he called the greatest truth in the room. In other words, you don't just paint things, but the difference between things. I last saw Sig at one of my openings at Forum Gallery here in New York, and we made a date to have Zabar's chocolate babka and coffee in his apartment on West 67th Street. It never happened. Sig died on December 21st. In 1970, the fabulous Greenville County Museum of Art published a book called Contemporary Artists of South Carolina, profiling some of the finest artists from my home state. Last month, the museum published a follow-up to that monograph entitled, At This Moment, Portraits of South Carolina Artists. Thoughtfully curated by my friend Mark Sloan and photographed by Jerry Siegel, some of the same artists from the 1970 book reappear, such as Jasper Johns, Boyd Saunders, and Sigmund Abeles. This time, I sit beside them. Jerry took this portrait in my studio in the winter of 2024. I was going for 1973 Johnny Cash, but looked more 2016 Cracker Barrel. Here's the painting I gifted to Brookgreen Gardens in honor of Sigmund Abeles. Katie and I flew down to Greenville for Jerry's exhibition of the photographs from the book, paired with a special exhibition of my paintings in the museum's collection, paired with those of my great teachers from the College of Charleston, William Halsey and Michael Tyzak. Never in a million years would I have dreamt that I'd hang in a great American museum next to my teachers. When I was a graduate student at the School of Visual Arts from 1987 to 1989, I had the honor of studying with Walter Darby Bannard. Darby was an important figure in the evolution of color field painting from the 1950s onward. He was also a prolific writer for Art Forum, Art in America, and many museum publications. He also wrote the preface to my first monograph. Not only did Darby introduce me to the best tuna salad on a bagel sandwich I've ever had, and I associate everything with food, he also introduced me to the German philosopher Hegel's theory of dialectics, which you and I use subconsciously all the time in our studios, but I love how compact it is. And the system is essentially in three parts: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. You begin with an idea, a thesis. Next, you introduce the opposite idea, or antithesis. Finally, you come up with a resolution between the two, a synthesis. You start with a point of view, then you introduce the opposite point of view, and finally, a compromise between the two, which results in a third thing. That, on a granular level, is the creative act. But creativity is not talent. Creativity is curiosity and effort. You have to be available 100% of the time. My teacher, Michael Tyzak at the College of Charleston, used to say, "Bry, you're making a painting. Don't miss it." For example, the left third of my painting is my thesis, a presentation of forms and colors that suggest branches, currents, and tides seen close up. The center is my antithesis or antithesis. The opposite of close and clear is depth and humidity. Soft transitions and lower saturation points suggest deep space. The antithesis generates energy by challenging the validity of the thesis through highlighting its limitations. You can't have far away without near. Finally, the right side is the synthesis, or resolution between thesis and antithesis, resulting in a new idea or understanding, incorporating colors and forms of both. 3 vantage points, close on the left, far away in the middle, and extreme close on the right, are compressed into a single view. As I always say, content in my painting is a direct function of how near or far something appears from your face. But this isn't a theory, it's a promise to that 10-year-old laying on his belly in pluff mud. Art begins in lived experience. As Eugene O'Neill said, a life with illusions is unpardonable, and a life without illusions is unbearable.